The soap here has a specific chemical bite, a mixture of cheap cherry scent and industrial degreaser that stays in the back of your throat long after the shift ends. My hands were numb, a permanent state of being since the temperature dropped in November. I watched the gray water swirl down the drain of the wash bay, carrying with it the salt and filth of a city that didn't care I existed. I used to sign checks larger than this entire city block, but today, my world was measured in the 15-minute increments it took to make a stranger's rims shine. I reached for the microfiber cloth tucked into my belt, my movements fluid and practiced. There is a certain meditation in manual labor that the corporate world lacks. In the boardroom, the filth is hidden behind tailored wool and dental veneers. Here, it's honest. It's right on the surface where a pressure washer can find it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp, insistent vibration that felt like a localized seizure. I didn't answer it. I already knew it was a notification from an app telling me my bank balance was below $50, or perhaps a mocking voicemail from a collection agency. I didn't need a digital reminder of my status. I lived it every time I felt the damp cold seep through the soles of my boots. As I worked the foam into the wheel well of a generic silver sedan, my mind drifted back to the glass towers. It wasn't the money I missed, really. It was the logistics. The way 1,000 moving parts, shipping containers, labor contracts, regional zoning laws, could be snapped together like a complex engine by a few strokes of my pen. I had been the architect of their expansion. I was the one who mapped the routes and negotiated the leases while they spent their weekends at the club, complaining about the humidity. The memory of the final meeting surfaced, unbidden but vivid. It hadn't been a shouting match. Those are for people who still have hope. It had been a quiet, surgical removal. "Brooks, we've looked at the restructuring costs," my father-in-law had said, his voice as dry as parchment. He didn't look at me. He looked at a point roughly 6 inches above my head. "The board feels, and I agree, that your role has become redundant. We're moving toward a decentralized model." My wife, or the woman who was currently using that title while her lawyer drafted the separation papers, had sat in the corner of the office. She was scrolling through her phone, her face a mask of polite boredom. She didn't offer a word of defense. Why would she? I was a tool that had finished its task. The empire was built. The heavy lifting was done. You don't keep the scaffolding once the cathedral is finished. You tear it down and haul it to the scrap heap. "There's a severance package, of course," she'd added, finally looking up. Her eyes were as green and cold as a shallow sea. "But given the circumstances of your performance reviews, the profit-sharing clauses are naturally voided. We need to keep the capital liquid for the Series B rollout." I remembered the way my mother-in-law had cornered me in the hallway on my way out, my cardboard box of personal effects cradled in my arms like a wounded pet. She had smiled, a thin, sharp expression that never reached her eyes. "Don't look so dour, Brooks," she'd whispered, her perfume cloying and expensive. "You always were better with your hands than your head. Maybe you can find work scrubbing toilets. It's more your speed, isn't it? Back to your roots." I hadn't replied. I had just walked to the elevator, the silence of the carpeted hall swallowing the sound of my footsteps. A horn honked, snapping me back to the present. The silver sedan was clean. The driver, a teenager who hadn't looked at me once, tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the wet concrete and sped away. I picked it up. It was damp. I stuffed it into my pocket and moved to the next bay. My apartment was a studio above a laundromat 3 miles away. It smelled of scorched lint and old grease. Every night, I sat at a small folding table and tracked my expenses on a yellow legal pad. I was precise. I knew exactly how many calories I could afford and how many miles I could walk before my boots gave out. It was a different kind of logistics, but the principle remained the same: optimization. I sat down that evening, the dampness of the wash bay still clinging to my skin. I opened my laptop, an aging machine with a cracked screen that I'd managed to keep hidden during the asset seizure. I began to look through my old personal emails, searching for a specific date, a specific attachment. Most of my access had been cut off within minutes of my termination. They were thorough. They had changed the passwords, wiped the servers, and scrubbed my name from the digital directory. But they were also arrogant. They assumed that because I was out of the building, I was out of the equation. They viewed me as a spent force, a man broken by the weight of his own sudden insignificance. I found the thread from 2018. It was an internal memo regarding the restructuring of the equity pool. At the time, I had been offered a choice: a 6-figure performance bonus or a redirected allocation into the Series B shares of the holding company. I had been the one to draft the language for that allocation. I remembered the ex-friend who handled the legal side, a man who had smiled while he handed me the pink slip a year later. He had been so focused on making sure the paperwork was clean for the upcoming acquisition that he hadn't realized he was fortifying my position. I looked at the PDF attachment. It was a standard equity grant, but with a specific rider I had insisted on during a late-night session when everyone else was too tired to argue. It stipulated that the shares were protected against dilution in the event of a subsidiary acquisition, provided the holder was engaged in the operational expansion of the firm at the time of the grant. I had been more than engaged. I had been the engine. They thought they had voided it. They thought the termination for performance issues had triggered a clawback. But the language was ironclad. The clawback only applied to the Series A preferred stock. The Series B, the ones tied to the actual infrastructure and debt instruments of the company, were vested and separate. I leaned back in my creaky chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in the dark window of the studio. I wasn't angry. Anger is heat, and heat dissipates. I was cold. I was the temperature of the water in the wash bay at 5 a.m. The family was currently celebrating. I knew this because I occasionally checked the social media pages of the company. They were announcing a massive merger, a move that would solidify their status as a regional powerhouse. They were talking about streamlining and exponential growth. They were standing in the lobby I had designed, drinking champagne I had curated for the office cellar. They thought I was a ghost. They thought they had erased the man who knew where the skeletons were buried because they were the ones who had put them there. But they had forgotten one thing about ghosts. They don't need permission to enter a room. I looked at the numbers on the screen. If the acquisition went through at the price the analysts were predicting, my worthless equity wasn't just a consolation prize. It was a lever. And with a long enough lever, you can move the world. Or in this case, you can move a family right out of their own front door. I closed the laptop and looked at my hands. The skin was cracked around the cuticles, stained with the gray grime of the day's labor. I thought about the Ferrari I had seen earlier that week, the way the light hit the chrome. It was a beautiful machine, but it required constant maintenance to keep it from rusting from the inside out. Everything requires maintenance. Relationships, empires, revenge. You have to be patient. You have to wait for the right moment to apply the pressure. If you do it too early, the bolt snaps. If you do it too late, the opportunity passes. But if you do it with the precision of a man who has nothing left to lose but his sense of timing, you can dismantle anything. Oh, I stood up and went to the small sink to wash my hands. I used the cheap bar soap, scrubbing until my skin was raw. The scent of cherry and degreaser filled the small room. I wasn't a manager anymore. I wasn't a husband or a son-in-law. I was a line item. I was the one variable they had failed to account for in their grand projections. I turned off the light and lay down on the thin mattress. The sound of the laundromat below hummed through the floorboards, a steady, mechanical rhythm that mimicked the pulse of a city that never slept. I closed my eyes and began to calculate. I didn't dream of money. I didn't dream of the life I had lost. I dreamed of the look on her face when she realized that the man scrubbing the rims was the one who owned the car. Tomorrow, I would go back to the wash bay. I would pick up the sponge and the hose. I would be invisible, observant, and silent. I would wait for the phone to ring or for the right car to pull into the lot. I would wait for the moment the math finally caught up with them. The math never lies. It's the only thing in this world that doesn't. And according to my legal pad, the debt was about to come due. The rhythm of the car wash is a brutal, mechanical metronome. It dictates when you eat, when you stand, and how long you are allowed to feel the warmth of the sun before the shadow of the next SUV engulfs you. By the second week of December, the novelty of the meditative labor had worn thin, replaced by a dull, aching clarity. I was no longer a man. I was a biological extension of a high-pressure nozzle. My skin had taken on a permanent translucent pallor, the kind you see on creatures that live in the deepest parts of the ocean, untouched by light or hope. Yet, beneath that surface, the gears I had set in motion during those late nights at my folding table were beginning to grind. The studio apartment was no longer just a place to survive, it had become a command center. I had spent my meager savings on a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot. I didn't trust the laundromat's public signal, and I certainly didn't trust the local library. Privacy is the first thing the poor lose, and it was the one thing I needed to reclaim if I was going to execute the transition. I spent my evenings navigating the labyrinthine filings of the Securities and Exchange Commission, pulling down the public disclosures of the family firm's impending merger. They were moving fast. The ego of my father-in-law, a man who viewed himself as a titan of industry despite having inherited the foundation of his wealth, was a predictable variable. He wanted the legacy, he wanted the press release, and because he wanted it so badly, he was overlooking the fine print. The morning shift started at 6. The air was a crystalline gray, the kind of cold that feels like it's trying to crack your ribs. I was working the premium bay, the one reserved for the clients who didn't mind paying an extra $50 for hand-applied carnauba wax and specialized wheel treatment. It was here that I saw the Ferrari. It wasn't a modern, soulless wedge of carbon fiber. It was a vintage 1960s model, a 250 GT Lusso in a deep midnight blue. It was a masterpiece of engineering and aesthetics, a car that demanded respect rather than just attention. The man who stepped out of it was equally vintage. Mr. Sterling was a regular, though I had only seen him from a distance in previous weeks. He was 80 if he was a day, with a spine like a steel rod and a suit that cost more than my entire annual salary at the wash. He didn't look at the manager. He looked at the bay, he looked at the tools, and then he looked at me. "The wire wheels," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Don't use the acidic cleaner. It ruins the finish on the spokes. Use the pH-neutral solution and do it by hand." "I already have the bucket ready, Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice steady. "And the horsehair brush. I wouldn't dream of putting a pressurized stream near those hubs." He paused, his hand halfway to his pocket for his keys. He squinted at me, his eyes sharp and analytical behind gold-rimmed spectacles. There was a flicker of recognition, a momentary glitch in the matrix of class dynamics. He knew my face, but his brain was struggling to reconcile the location. "You're the logistics man," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "From the distribution firm. Brooks, isn't it?" I didn't flinch. I didn't feel a surge of shame. If anything, the recognition felt like the first solid ground I had stepped on in months. "I was, Mr. Sterling. Now I'm the man who ensures your Ferrari doesn't develop premature oxidation." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say he was sorry for my change in fortune. Men like Sterling don't deal in pity, they deal in assets. "I heard about the restructuring. Messy. The family wanted a clean slate, I suppose. It's a shame. You were the only one in that boardroom who understood the difference between a balance sheet and a dream." He leaned against the brick wall of the bay, watching as I knelt by the front tire. I began the painstaking process of cleaning the individual wire spokes. It was a task that required patience and a delicate touch, traits I had honed while managing 3,000 employees across 4 states. "They're finalizing the acquisition of the tri-state subsidiary," Sterling said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Big move. It'll triple their valuation on paper, but they're over-leveraged. They've taken on a massive amount of mezzanine debt to bridge the gap before the Series B conversion." I paused, the brush mid-stroke. "The Series B conversion?" "Yes," Sterling said, checking his watch. "The private equity group I consult for was looking at taking a piece of it, but the cap table is a mess. There's a block of shares that's causing a hang-up in the final audit. Some old protected equity that survived the dilution rounds. The family is trying to litigate it into non-existence, but the paperwork is unusually robust. The lead counsel mentioned it last night at dinner. He was quite frustrated." I felt a cold, sharp sensation in the center of my chest. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of a hunter seeing the target step into the clearing. I kept my head down, focusing on the chrome. "Is that so? I imagine that's a significant hurdle for a merger of this scale." "Significant? It's a wall," Sterling said. "They can't close until that block is accounted for or signed off. The valuation is tied to the total control of the holding company. If even 10% is floating out there, the buyers won't trigger the wire. They're terrified of a minority shareholder lawsuit once the profits start rolling in." He looked at me again, his gaze lingering on my wet, stained uniform. "I don't suppose you'd know anything about that, would you, Brooks? You were the one who structured the 2018 expansion." "I was very thorough with my filing systems, Mr. Sterling," I said, standing up. I wiped my hands on a towel, my movements slow and deliberate. I believed in protecting the integrity of the firm's long-term obligations. Sterling smiled, a thin, knowing expression. 12%. That's the number they're choking on. At the current acquisition valuation, that stake is worth approximately $5.7 billion. On paper, anyway. Of course, it's only worth that if the holder knows they have it, and if they have the iron in their soul to hold out against the family's intimidation tactics. 5.7 billion. The number didn't feel real. It was an abstraction, a mountain of zeros that had no correlation to the $5 bill in my pocket or the cheap soap in my lungs. But the mechanics were real. The 12% was the exact figure of my protected allocation, the line item they had dismissed as a clerical error or a ghost of a previous administration. "You're still on the cap table, aren't you?" Sterling asked quietly. I looked him in the eye. I didn't hide. I didn't look away. "I'm still on the cap table." Sterling nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy card. It wasn't a business card. It was a private contact for a boutique legal firm specializing in high-stakes corporate disputes. "They think you're gone, Brooks. They think they've scrubbed you out. In their minds, you're just another expense they've managed to minimize. They're celebrating in the penthouse while you're down here in the suds." He handed me the card. "If I were you, I wouldn't celebrate. I wouldn't even smile. I would just calculate." He turned and walked toward the lounge, leaving me alone with the Ferrari. I looked at the car. It was a beautiful, fragile thing. If you hit it with too much pressure, you'd dent the aluminum. If you used the wrong chemical, you'd ruin the paint. But if you knew exactly where the stress points were, you could take it apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but a skeleton on the floor. I finished the car. I did it with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. I polished every inch of the midnight blue paint until it reflected the gray sky like a mirror. When Sterling returned, he didn't say another word. He just handed the manager a $100 bill, gestured toward me as the recipient of the tip, and drove away. The manager, a man named Gary, who spent most of his time watching sports highlights in a heated booth, walked over and handed me the bill. "The hell did you do to that old guy? He never tips like that." "I just gave him exactly what he asked for, Gary," I said, tucking the money into my pocket. "Whatever. Get to Bay 4. There's a minivan with a spilled gallon of milk in the back. Smells like a swamp. Make it disappear." I spent the next 4 hours on my knees, scrubbing spoiled dairy out of polyester carpeting. The smell was revolting, a cloying, sour rot that seemed to cling to my hair and skin. Every time my stomach turned, I thought of the number, 5.7 billion. I thought of the way my wife had looked at her phone while my life was being dismantled. I thought of my father-in-law's dismissive gaze. The contrast was my fuel. The humiliation of the minivan was the grit in the oyster. Every time I inhaled the scent of the rotting milk, I reminded myself that this was the last time I would ever be at the mercy of someone else's mess. I wasn't just cleaning a car, I was maintaining the mask. I needed them to believe I was broken. I needed them to see me, if they bothered to look at all, as a man who had accepted his fate as a permanent member of the underclass. The silence was my greatest asset. That night back in the studio, I didn't eat. I sat at the folding table and stared at the card Sterling had given me. I didn't call the number yet. First, I needed to see the battlefield for myself. I opened my laptop and began to map out the debt structure of the family firm. Sterling had mentioned they were over-leveraged. In my experience, when people like my father-in-law get greedy, they don't just borrow money, they sell their future to pay for their present. I found the filings for the mezzanine debt. It was held by a consortium of 3 mid-sized banks. They were aggressive, high-interest loans with hair-trigger covenants. If the merger didn't close by the end of the first quarter, the interest rates would spike. If the valuation of the holding company dropped by even 5%, the banks had the right to call the notes. They were walking a tightrope, and they were doing it without a net because they were certain I was a ghost. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. I looked older, thinner, and harder. The softness of the corporate executive had been burned away by the cold and the soap. I was a leaner version of the man who had built their empire. I was the architect who knew exactly which load-bearing wall to remove to make the entire structure pancake into the basement. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. It was late, but I knew the kind of firm this was. They didn't have office hours, they had objectives. "This is Brooks," I said when a voice finally answered. "I'm the 12%. I want to discuss the terms of my silence and the price of my noise." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of typing. "We've been expecting a call from someone in your position, Mr. Brooks," the voice said, sounding polished and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Sterling indicated you might be reaching out. How would you like to proceed?" "I don't want a settlement," I said, watching a cockroach scuttle across the floor near the radiator. "I want the debt. I want to know who is holding the notes on the warehouse facilities and the regional headquarters. And I want to know exactly how much it will cost me to buy their position." "That's a very aggressive stance, Mr. Brooks. You're talking about acquiring hundreds of millions in distressed debt before you've even liquidated your equity." "I have the equity," I said, "and the family is about to realize that I'm the only one who can sign the papers they need to survive. Use the equity as collateral, acquire the debt. I want to be their only creditor by the time they realize I'm their only shareholder." I hung up before he could respond. I didn't need to hear his legal warnings or his professional skepticism. I knew the math. I knew the people. And most importantly, I knew how to wait. I turned off the laptop and lay down. For the first time since the day I was fired, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the heat of a machine starting up, a massive, silent engine that was designed for only one thing. The era of scrubbing rims was over. The era of scrubbing the family name from the building was about to begin. The air in the private law office was filtered, pressurized, and scented with nothing at all. It was a staggering contrast to the humid, chemical-laden atmosphere of the car wash. I sat in a chair upholstered in leather so soft it felt like a second skin, looking across a mahogany desk at a man whose hourly rate exceeded my monthly rent. His name was Elias Thorne, and he was the kind of person who specialized in the quiet rearrangement of power. To the world, I was still the man in the damp blue jumpsuit, but here, in the silence of the 44th floor, I was a ghost returning to claim his haunt. "The verification is complete," Thorne said, sliding a thick tablet across the desk. "The 2018 rider you insisted upon was never officially rescinded because it was housed within the subsidiary's operating agreement, not the parent company's primary bylaws. When your father-in-law initiated the corporate veil-piercing maneuver to streamline the acquisition, he inadvertently pulled your protected shares into the top-tier cap table. You don't just own a piece of a warehouse, Mr. Brooks. You own 12% of the entire holding entity, including the intellectual property and the real estate." I didn't smile. I scanned the digital documents, my eyes tracking the familiar language of debt and equity. I had spent years writing these kinds of scripts. Reading them was like breathing. And the valuation? "Pending the merger with the Tri-State Group, your position is currently appraised at $5.7 billion. However," Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a professional sort of hunger, "that value only exists if the merger closes. If the deal collapses, the company's debt-to-equity ratio becomes unsustainable. They've borrowed against the projected closing. They are, quite literally, betting the house on a hand they haven't won yet." "I don't want them to win the hand," I said. "I want to be the house." The strategy was simple in theory but surgical in execution. I was using my equity as a massive piece of collateral to secure credit lines from rival institutions, banks that were more than happy to help me dismantle a competitor from the inside. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the invisible laborer, scrubbing the road salt off the wheels of luxury cars. I watched the family's black sedans cruise through the city, oblivious to the fact that the man with the sponge was slowly purchasing their liabilities. I authorized Thorne to begin the quiet acquisition of the company's supplier debt. Most of the family's regional warehouses were leased through a third-party management firm that was currently struggling with its own liquidity issues. I bought those leases. I bought the outstanding invoices for the fleet of delivery trucks. I even bought the distress notes on the very building where my wife was currently planning her next social gala. I remained publicly invisible. I didn't change my address. I didn't buy new clothes. I continued to eat the same bland, budget-conscious meals at my folding table. Power is most effective when it is a secret. When people know you are coming, they build walls. When they think you are already defeated, they leave the gates wide open. The internal commentary in my mind was a constant loop of logistics. I viewed the family as a supply chain with a fatal bottleneck: me. They had removed me to save money, not realizing that I was the one keeping the creditors at bay through sheer operational competence. Now that I was gone, the friction was starting to show. I could see it in the news clippings and the industry whispers. Deliveries were late. Quality control was slipping. The decentralized model my father-in-law loved so much was actually just a fancy term for chaos. One afternoon, during a rare break between shifts, I took a bus to the industrial district. I stood across the street from the primary warehouse, the one I had personally scouted and opened 6 years ago. I wore a heavy coat with the collar turned up, a generic cap pulled low over my eyes. I watched the trucks roll out. They were poorly loaded. The tires were low on air. The drivers looked exhausted and disgruntled. It was a hollow shell. They were stripping the assets to make the balance sheet look attractive for the buyers, unaware that I now owned the ground beneath their feet. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the fiery heat of a grudge. It was the cool, professional realization that my assessment had been correct. They were amateurs playing with a professional's tools. "Can I help you, pal?" a security guard asked, stepping toward the fence. He was new. He didn't recognize me. "Just looking for work," I said, my voice raspy from the winter air. "Not here. We're freezing all hiring until the merger. Move along." I nodded and turned away. He was right. They were freezing everything. They were holding their breath, waiting for the massive payday that would erase their mistakes. They didn't realize the air was already running out. Back at Thorne's office 2 days later, the trap was ready to be sprung. We sat in the conference room, surrounded by monitors displaying the real-time financial health of the holding company. "We've secured 60% of their operational debt," Thorne reported. "The banks have agreed to a simultaneous transfer of the notes to a shell company under your control. We've also initiated a formal inquiry into the cap table through an anonymous third party. Your father-in-law received the notice this morning. He's panicking." "How do you know?" I asked. "Oh, he tried to call a private meeting with the lead auditor to correct the records. The auditor, who is now being shadowed by our legal team, refused. The merger is now in a state of indefinite suspension until the 12% stake is verified and the holder is identified. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Trigger the debt calls. Thorne paused, a pen hovering over a document. If we do this now, we trigger a technical default on their primary mortgage. They'll have 48 hours to produce the capital, or the bank, which you now essentially control, can move for a forced restructuring. I know the timeline, Elias. Trigger it. The action was nonviolent, but it was devastating. With a few keystrokes, we sent a series of formal demands to the company's treasury. We called in the truck leases. We demanded immediate payment on the warehouse equipment. We notified them that the building's mortgage had been sold to a new entity that was not interested in extending their grace period. I left the office and went back to the car wash. I had one more shift to finish. I spent the afternoon cleaning a minivan that had been used to transport a soccer team. The interior was a disaster of crushed crackers and sticky juice spills. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was no longer the victim of this filth. I was merely a guest in it, passing through on my way to something much more permanent. The rehook came at the end of the day. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, began to explode with notifications. My ex-wife was calling. My father-in-law was calling. Even the ex-friend who had facilitated my removal was sending urgent texts. Brooks, we need to talk. Urgent. Where are you? Call me immediately. We found the filing. Let's be reasonable. I ignored them all. I finished the minivan. I wiped the last of the juice from the cup holders and presented the keys to the mother, who didn't even look at me as she handed over a $5 tip. I took the money. I walked to the locker room, peeled off my damp jumpsuit, and left it in a heap on the floor. I wouldn't be needing it again. I walked to a nearby parking garage where a silver sedan was waiting for me. It wasn't a Ferrari, but it was new, clean, and paid for in cash. Inside the glove box was a folder containing the deed to the headquarters and the voting proxies for the board of directors. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling smoothly. The sun was setting, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. My phone buzzed again. This time, I looked at the screen. It was a picture sent from an unknown number, likely a private investigator hired by the family. It was a photo of me, taken through the fence of the warehouse earlier that week. I looked haggard, poor, and broken. I deleted the photo. They were looking at a man who no longer existed. The cliffhanger wasn't in the mystery of what would happen next, but in the timing. I had scheduled a meeting for the following morning at the corporate headquarters. I had sent the invitation through Thorne, phrased as a consultation with the primary creditor and majority stakeholder. I hadn't used my name. I wanted them to spend the night in the dark, wondering who had the power to bring their world to a halt. As I drove away from the car wash, I felt the shift in my own internal architecture. The man who had been erased was gone. The man who had been built in the shadows was taking his place. I wasn't going back to my studio apartment. Thorne had arranged a suite at a hotel overlooking the park, a place where the soap didn't smell like cherries and the towels were never damp. I checked my watch. In 12 hours, I would be standing in the room where they had told me I was redundant. I would be sitting in the chair they had taken from me, and I would be the one holding the pen. The math was finished, the logistics were settled. The only thing left was the execution of the final act. I felt a cold, steady pulse of anticipation. It wasn't the adrenaline of a fight. It was the satisfaction of a master weaver pulling the final thread to reveal the pattern. They had laughed while I scrubbed their rims, never realizing that every circular motion was a countdown. The lights of the city blurred past me, a neon tapestry of a world I was about to own again. I thought of the mother-in-law's comment about scrubbing toilets. I hoped she enjoyed the irony. Because by this time tomorrow, she wouldn't even be able to afford the soap. The hotel suite was silent, a vast expanse of marble and high thread count linens that felt alien against my skin. I had spent the night watching the city lights, my mind occupied by the shifting tides of capital. On the bedside table, my old phone continued to vibrate with the frantic energy of a trapped insect. The family was realizing that the walls were closing in, but they were still looking for an exit that didn't exist. They were looking for a loophole, a legal technicality, or perhaps a person to blame. They had yet to realize that the person they were looking for was the one they had pushed into the gutter. By 8 a.m, the financial collapse of the family empire began to move from a private crisis to a public spectacle. I sat at a small glass desk, sipping a coffee that tasted of nothing but heat, and watched the internal data feeds Thorne had provided. The primary mortgage on the regional headquarters had been officially called. Because the debt had been consolidated and sold to my shell company, there was no room for negotiation. The grace periods had been waived in the fine print of a secondary agreement they had signed 6 months prior to stay afloat. They had been so focused on the horizon of the merger that they hadn't noticed the ground eroding beneath their feet. The calls from my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, transitioned from demanding to transactional. She left a message at 9:15. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the hairline fractures in her composure. Brooks, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing with these legal inquiries, but you need to stop. We are in the middle of a massive transition. If you're trying to leverage a better divorce settlement by stalling the audit, it won't work. You're only hurting yourself. She still thought this was about a settlement. She still thought I was a small man trying to claw back a few scraps from the table. It was a failure of imagination that would cost her everything. I spent the morning at a high-end dealership, though not the kind that advertised on television. This was a private showroom, a quiet gallery of automotive history. I didn't look at the sleek, modern hypercars. I walked directly to a 1964 Ferrari, the same midnight blue as Mr. Sterling's. I didn't need to test drive it. I knew every specification, every torque curve, and every potential flaw. I bought it with a wire transfer that cleared in seconds. The salesman looked at my generic clothes and my weathered hands with a mixture of confusion and professional deference. The money was real, even if the man didn't look the part. "I'll have it delivered to this address at 2 o'clock, I said, handing him a card for the corporate headquarters. "Certainly, Mr. Brooks. Will you be there to receive it?" "I'll be the one holding the keys," I replied. The drive to the office took 20 minutes. I watched the familiar skyline approach, the glass tower of the family firm glinting in the winter sun like a jagged tooth. As I neared the district, I could see the signs of the day's turmoil. Delivery trucks from the warehouse were parked haphazardly on the side of the road, their drivers standing on the pavement in small, anxious clusters. I knew why. The fuel accounts had been frozen. The lease on the fleet had been revoked. The logistics chain I had spent a decade perfecting was snapping in real time, link by link. I parked my modest rental car a block away. I wanted to see the impact from the street level. The lobby of the headquarters was a hive of controlled panic. Couriers were arriving with formal notices of default. Security guards were looking at their tablets, likely receiving notifications that their payroll processing had been stalled. In the center of the marble floor, my father-in-law was standing near the elevators, his face a shade of gray that matched his expensive suit. He was shouting into a phone, his gestures wide and desperate. "I don't care about the secondary market. Find out who bought the notes. Someone is sitting on our credit line, and I want a name." He looked right at me as I entered the lobby. For a heartbeat, his eyes didn't register who I was. I was just another man in a coat, another face in the crowd. Then the recognition hit him like a physical blow. He stopped shouting. The phone stayed pressed to his ear, but he had stopped listening. I didn't approach him. I didn't gloat. I simply walked to the security desk. The guard, a man I had hired 3 years ago named Marcus, looked up and blinked. "Mr. Brooks, you're not on the access list today, sir. I'm sorry, but things are a bit... well, you can see." "It's all right, Marcus," I said, leaning against the desk. "I'm not here for an interview. I'm here for the meeting with the primary creditor. I believe it's scheduled for the executive boardroom." Marcus looked at his screen. "We have a Sentinel Holdings listed for a 10 o'clock appointment, but there's no name attached to the representative." "I am the representative for Sentinel," I said. Behind me, I heard the heavy tread of my father-in-law's shoes on the marble. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip tight and trembling. "What is this, Brooks? What are you doing here? If you're here to beg for your job back because you've run out of grocery money, you've picked the worst possible day." I turned slowly, removing his hand from my coat with a precise, clinical movement. "I'm not here for a job, Arthur, and I'm certainly not here to beg. I'm here because you've defaulted on 4 separate operational loans, and the terms of your mortgage allow for an immediate inspection of the premises by the debt holder." "You?" He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You're the debt holder? With what? The nickels you made scrubbing tires? Don't be absurd. You're a middle manager with a grudge. Go home before I have security throw you out again." "Marcus," I said, looking at the guard, "could you please inform Mr. Sterling's office that I've arrived? And perhaps check the updated ownership filing for the building's holding company. It was processed at midnight." Marcus began typing, his brow furrowing. Arthur stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between me and the security desk. The silence in the lobby seemed to thicken. People stopped moving. The frantic energy of the morning began to settle into a heavy, suffocating dread. "The building," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. It's listed under Sentinel, and the authorized signatory is... it's you, sir." The color drained from Arthur's face. He looked at the marble floor, the glass walls, and the ceiling as if he were seeing them for the first time, or as if he were seeing them disappear. "That's impossible. That equity was voided. We had the lawyers look at it. We had it scrubbed." You had the Series A scrubbed, Arthur, I said, my voice calm and conversational. You were so busy protecting your own shares that you forgot to look at the subsidiary's debt equity conversion riders from 2018, the ones I wrote, the ones your legal team thought were too small to matter. It turns out that 12% of a multi-billion-dollar merger is enough to buy a lot of things, including your debt, including your office. The elevators opened and my wife stepped out. She was dressed for a celebration, a sharp white suit that projected power and purity. She saw me, and her expression shifted from confusion to a cold, simmering irritation. "Brooks, what are you doing in the lobby? I told you on the voicemail this isn't the time." "He owns the building, Claire," Arthur said, his voice barely audible. She stopped in her tracks. She looked at her father, then at me. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She did something much more revealing. She calculated. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the way she was already trying to find a way to pivot, to charm, or to negotiate her way back into a position of strength. "Brooks," she said, her voice softening, taking on that transactional warmth she used on clients. "If you found a way to help the company through this liquidity crisis, we should talk in private. There's no need for this to be a public matter. We're family, after all." "We were a contract, Claire," I said, "and you breached it. Now I'm just a creditor exercising my rights. The board is waiting upstairs. I suggest we go up. We have a lot of paperwork to go through, and I'd like to be finished by the time my new car arrives." I walked toward the elevators. The doors opened for me as if on cue. I didn't hold the door for them. I stood in the center of the car, watching them through the narrowing gap. They scrambled to join me, their expensive shoes clicking frantically on the stone. As the elevator ascended, the digital display ticked through the floors. Each number represented a level of the company I had built. Each floor was filled with people who had been told I was a failure, a redundant piece of meat to be discarded. The silence in the elevator was absolute. Arthur was staring at his own reflection in the brushed metal, his hands shaking. Claire was looking at me, her eyes searching for a weakness, a spark of the old Brooks she could manipulate. She found nothing. I was as cold and smooth as the chrome on a vintage Ferrari. I was the personification of the math they had ignored. The doors opened on the executive floor. The receptionist, a woman who had once ignored my greetings when I was on my way out with my cardboard box, stood up and bowed her head slightly. She knew. The news had already traveled up the wires. "The board is in the conference room, Mr. Brooks," she said. I walked past her, my stride long and confident. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of a machine that was finally running at full capacity. I was the architect, the builder, and now the owner. I pushed open the double doors of the boardroom. The directors were all there, sitting around the long mahogany table. These were the men who had voted for my termination. These were the men who had laughed at the restructuring and toasted to the future of the company without me. I walked to the head of the table, the seat where Arthur usually sat. I pulled the chair out and sat down. I placed my legal pad on the table and looked at the faces staring back at me. "Good morning," I said. "Let's begin with the status of the tri-state merger, or rather, why I've decided to cancel it." The rehook was the silence that followed. It was a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wasn't just there to take my share. I was there to take the entire game away from them. I watched as the realization dawned on them. I wasn't there to save the company. I was there to dismantle it. The executive boardroom was a vacuum of sound. The thick glass windows muffled the roar of the city, leaving only the hum of the climate control system and the shallow, rhythmic breathing of the 12 people sitting around the mahogany table. I sat at the head, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight, a sound that seemed amplified in the stagnant air. I didn't look like a man who had spent the last several months scrubbing road salt off of luxury SUVs. I looked like a man who had finally come home to a house he had never truly left. Arthur sat to my left, his face a map of collapsing pride. Claire sat directly across from me, her posture rigid, her fingers entwined so tightly that her knuckles were the color of bone. The rest of the board members, men who had avoided my gaze for a year, now stared at me with the wide-eyed intensity of people watching a slow-motion collision. They were waiting for the speech, the outburst, or the grand gesture of vindication. I gave them none of those. I simply opened a leather portfolio and laid out 3 separate documents. "The tri-state merger is a non-starter," I began, my voice flat and professional. "I have reviewed the acquisition terms, and the valuation is based on a projected revenue stream that assumes a total lack of operational friction. However, as the primary holder of your mezzanine debt and the owner of the physical infrastructure where your logistics are housed, I am refusing to sign the non-disturbance agreements required by the buyers. Without my signature, the merger is legally a voided husk." "You can't do that," one of the directors stammered, his voice thin and reedy. That merger is the only thing keeping the stock from cratering. If you block this, you're destroying the value of your own 12%. You're thinking like a person who needs the money, I said, leaning back. I've spent the last few months living on $50 a week. I've learned that value is a subjective concept. To you, 12% is a number on a screen. To me, it's a lever, and right now, I'm pulling it. I slid the first document toward Arthur. It was a formal notice of acceleration for the building's mortgage. As of 9 o'clock this morning, the holding company is in technical default. I have elected not to offer a cure period. This building, the furniture we are currently using, and the server racks in the basement now belong to Sentinel Holdings. That is my company. Arthur's hand reached for the paper, but he didn't pick it up. He stared at it as if it were a poisonous thing. Brooks, be reasonable. We can restructure. We can give you your old seat back. We can even discuss a senior partnership. I don't want a partnership with people who couldn't see a collapse coming when they were the ones who pulled the pins out of the foundation, I replied. I looked at Claire. She was watching me with a strange, predatory focus. She wasn't horrified, she was assessing my new market value. What do you want, Brooks? She asked, her voice silky and dangerous. If it's not the money and it's not the job, what are we doing here? Is this just about making us watch you sit in that chair? It's about the cleanup, Claire, I said. When a car comes into the wash covered in filth, you don't just rinse the surface. You have to get into the wheel wells. You have to scrub the undercarriage. You have to remove the parts that are too rusted to function. I brought my hand down on the table. It wasn't a violent strike, but the solid thud of palm against wood made several people jump. The sound echoed, sharp and final. This board is dissolved, effective immediately. I am exercising the voting power of the Series B shares to remove the current executive leadership. Arthur, you are no longer the chairman. Claire, your role in regional operations is terminated for cause. Specifically, the gross negligence of allowing a hostile entity to acquire 60% of your operational debt without a single internal red flag. The room erupted. It wasn't a roar, but a chaotic overlap of voices, denials, legal threats, and desperate pleas. My mother-in-law, who had been sitting in the gallery chairs at the back of the room, stood up. She had been silent until now, her face a mask of performative shock. You ungrateful little man, she hissed, stepping toward the table. Her expensive heels clicked like a countdown on the hardwood. We gave you everything. We brought you into this family. We gave you a life you never could have earned on your own, and you reward us by trying to steal the roof over our heads. You're still just a boy from the sticks with soap under his fingernails. I looked at her, and for the first time in the meeting, I felt a genuine flicker of amusement. It was cold, but it was there. You didn't give me anything, Evelyn. I built the logistics chain that paid for your summer house. I negotiated the contracts that bought those pearls. And as for the soap under my fingernails, it taught me how to recognize a stain that won't come out. You are the stain. I pressed a button on the intercom. Security. The doors opened instantly. Marcus and 2 other guards I recognized from the lobby entered the room. They didn't look at Arthur. They didn't look at the board. They looked at me. They were wearing new badges. Sentinel Holdings badges. Please escort the former chairman and his family from the building, I said. They are allowed to take their personal phones and any items that fit into a standard courier envelope. Everything else stays. The laptops, the files, the keys, they belong to the firm. You can't do this, Arthur shouted, finally standing up. His face was a dark, unhealthy shade of purple. I founded this company. I put my name on the door. And I bought the door, Arthur, I said quietly. Now please, don't make Marcus be forceful. It would be an undignified end to such a storied career. The physical tension in the room was palpable. It was a nonviolent confrontation, a battle of wills backed by the absolute weight of legal ownership. Arthur looked at the guards, then at the board members who were already beginning to gather their things, sensing the shift in the wind. These men were survivors. They weren't going to go down with a sinking ship when the new captain was offering them a life raft. Claire stood up slowly. She walked around the table until she was standing inches from me. I could smell her perfume, the same cloying, expensive scent that had filled the hallway on the day I was fired. You think this is the end, she whispered, her eyes narrowed. But you're not built for this, Brooks. You're a builder, not a shark. You'll choke on the complexity of what you've just started. I managed 3,000 people and $500 million in assets while you were deciding which color to paint the lobby, Claire. I said, I think I'll manage. She reached out as if to touch my face, a final desperate attempt at emotional leverage, but I caught her wrist. My grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. I felt the pulse in her arm, a fast, frantic thrumming. I lowered her hand back to her side. Osh. The car wash is about a mile from here. I said, my voice dropping so only she could hear. If you need a job, they're always looking for people who are good at following instructions. Though, I suspect you'll find the water a bit too cold for your liking. The guards moved in then, a silent professional wall. They guided Arthur toward the door. He moved like an old man, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps heavy and uneven. Evelyn followed him, her head held high in a facade of dignity that was crumbling with every step. Claire was the last to leave. She stopped at the threshold, looking back at the room, at the mahogany table, and finally at me. I didn't look back. I was already looking at the next document in my portfolio. As the doors closed behind them, a profound silence returned to the boardroom. The remaining directors sat like statues, waiting for their fate. I turned to the window. Down in the street, I could see the midnight blue Ferrari being backed off a flatbed trailer. It sat in the loading zone, a gleaming, perfect piece of machinery that owed nothing to anyone. "Gentlemen," I said, turning back to the table, "let's discuss the new organizational chart. We have a lot of work to do, and I don't like to leave a job half-finished." The cliffhanger wasn't a question of whether I had won. That was already settled. The cliffhanger was the realization that I had become the very thing they feared most, a man who had been through the fire and come out the other side as cold as the ash. I had the keys, I had the building, and I had the absolute, unwavering power to ensure that they would never, ever be allowed back inside. I looked at the legal pad where I had tracked my expenses in the studio apartment. I tore the top page off, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the wastebasket. That life was over. But the habits I had formed in the dark, the precision, the patience, the lack of mercy, those were the tools I would use to run this empire. I looked at the door. Tomorrow morning, I would walk through the lobby, and the floors would be clean, the air would be clear, and for the first time in years, the math would finally be correct. The morning light in the penthouse office was sharp, devoid of the hazy filter of city smog. It felt clinical. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the early commuters move like ants far below. They were all rushing towards something, a paycheck, a promotion, a sense of purpose. I no longer had to rush. The mechanical vibration of the building felt different today. It felt like a machine that was finally in sync with its operator. I had spent the last 12 hours finalizing the restructuring. It wasn't just a corporate reorganization, it was a total erasure. By midnight, the names of the previous board members had been removed from the digital directories. By 3 a.m, the locks on the executive elevator had been rekeyed to a biometric signature that only I and a select few of my new security team possessed. The transition was absolute. There would be no lingering ghosts in these hallways, no remnants of a regime that valued prestige over precision. I sat at the desk, Arthur's desk, though it had been scrubbed and polished until the wood glowed with a renewed cold luster. I opened the final folder of the day. It contained the eviction notices for the residential properties held by the corporate trust. This was the final thread. The house in the suburbs, the summer cottage on the coast, the luxury apartment in the city where Claire had spent her afternoons planning her social ascent. They were all assets of the firm, and the firm was now mine. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of my guest. I didn't say come in. The door was opened by Marcus, who stepped aside to allow Evelyn to enter. She looked different without the backdrop of a gala or a boardroom. She looked smaller, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled, her hair lacking its usual architectural rigidity. She carried a small designer handbag like a shield. "You can't do this, Brooks," she said, her voice lacking its former venom. It was replaced by a hollow, desperate vibration. "Arthur is in a state of collapse. He built this for 40 years. You're putting us on the street for a grudge." "I'm not putting you on the street, Evelyn," I said, not looking up from the documents. "I'm simply returning the assets to the company. The trust was designed to provide housing for the executive leadership. Since there is no longer a leadership role for your family, the benefit has reached its conclusion. It's a matter of logistics, not emotion." I reached into the drawer and pulled out a small, laminated card. It was an itemized invoice from the car wash where I had spent my months of exile. I had highlighted a specific line: detailed interior cleaning and rim restoration. "When I was at the wash," I said, sliding the card across the desk, "I learned the value of a job well done. I also learned that every debt, no matter how small, eventually requires a settlement. You once told me that scrubbing was my speed. I took that advice to heart. I've spent the last few weeks scrubbing your name off every contract, every building, and every bank account associated with this empire. It turns out I'm quite good at it." Evelyn stared at the invoice. Her hands began to shake, a fine tremor that made the diamonds on her fingers catch the light in a frantic, jagged pattern. "Where are we supposed to go?" The severance package I've authorized is more than enough for a modest apartment in the industrial district, I replied. It's near the laundromat. The rent is reasonable, and the noise from the street provides a certain perspective. I've already had your personal belongings moved there. You'll find them in a set of standard cardboard boxes. She didn't cry. People like Evelyn don't cry. They simply become husks. She turned and walked toward the door, her movement stiff and mechanical. She didn't look back. She knew, as well as I did, that the world she had occupied was gone. It hadn't been destroyed by fire or force. It had been dismantled by the very man she had mistaken for a tool. I checked my watch. It was time for the final walkthrough. I left the office and descended the stairs rather than taking the elevator. I wanted to feel the building. I walked through the marketing department, where the walls were being stripped of the old branding. I walked through the operations floor, where the staff sat in a hushed, focused silence. They knew the change was permanent. They knew the man in the corner office was no longer a figurehead, but the engineer who knew the weight of every bolt. I reached the lobby. The heavy glass doors were being etched with the new logo, Sentinel. It was a simple geometric design that suggested stability and observation. No flourishes, no egos. Outside, the air was biting. The midnight blue Ferrari was idling at the curb, its exhaust a steady, rhythmic pulse in the cold morning. I walked toward it, my boots clicking on the pavement. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel the warmth of satisfaction. I felt the stillness of a task completed. The ledger was balanced. The friction had been removed. I saw Arthur and Claire standing on the sidewalk across the street. They were waiting for a car that was no longer coming. They were surrounded by the city they thought they owned, looking like tourists who had lost their map. Arthur was staring at the building, his mouth slightly open as if he were waiting for the bricks to speak to him. Claire was looking at me. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of recognition and a burgeoning, horrific understanding of the scale of her miscalculation. I didn't wave. I didn't acknowledge them. I had already moved past them in every way that mattered. They were no longer variables in my equation. They were simply background noise, the fading echoes of a previous life. I reached the Ferrari and opened the door. The interior smelled of new leather and precision engineering. I sat in the driver's seat and felt the power of the machine beneath me. It was a tool, perfectly maintained and ready for the road ahead. I looked at the rearview mirror. I saw the building, my building, towering over the street. I saw the workers changing the signage. I saw the two figures on the sidewalk becoming smaller as the traffic began to flow. There was no need for reflection. There was no need for a final word or a dramatic exit. The revenge wasn't a destination. It was a process of restoration. I had restored the order of things. I had replaced the incompetent with the capable. I had turned the soap and the cold into a shield and a sword. I shifted the car into gear. The engine responded with a growl of repressed energy. I pulled away from the curb, moving smoothly into the stream of traffic. I didn't look back at the glass tower. I didn't look back at the family. I didn't look at the city. I drove toward the highway, the road opening up before me, a long black ribbon of possibility. The world was quiet. The math was settled. The past was a closed door, locked from the inside. I pressed the accelerator, and the car surged forward, leaving the ghosts of the Empire in the rearview mirror. The story didn't end with a sunset or a speech. It ended with the sound of a perfectly tuned engine and the cold, clear air of a winter morning. The floors were clean. The debt was paid. I exited the building. I exited their lives. I drove into the silence of the new day.